Let me start by running through what the 10 sessions are over the next few weeks, to which you all should have had invitations, calendar invitations. This first one is looking at creative industries policy. I'll say a bit more about what I'll cover in this session in a moment. Next week, Andrew Chitter will be leading a session looking at the creative industries from an industry perspective and talking in particular about the industrial structure and economic structure of the sector. Every few weeks, there are going to be review sessions, and I want to use these wisely. What I anticipate and what I'd like people to do during the course of the session today is to use the chat box to identify topics they'd like to hear more about. So you will see the full set of 10 lectures here. Obviously, I'm going to say in a moment what I'm going to run through. If there are things as I run through that I've glossed over and you'd like to spend a bit more time on, then please could you make some comments in the chat box, and we'll review that at the end, and we'll use these review sessions, the first of which is in a couple of weeks' time, to pick up on the things that people would like us to spend more time on that aren't otherwise identified in the lecture program. So the next set of 3, which is a few weeks later, will be on diversity, technology, and then again a third review session to do the same thing, to where there might have been topics identified in the sessions on diversity and technology that people want to spend a bit more time hearing about. Either something of a particular focus or some additional items that came up during the course of those lectures, that we'll pick those up in that review session. And then the last set of sessions that we've got scheduled, which run in September, are drilling down into individual subsectors: games and TV, performance, and that's galleries, libraries, archives and museums, and designer fashion. And again, we'll finish with a discussion session at the end. Now, I anticipate there may be more than one discussion session at the end, because there would have been a lot of ground covered. And I do want to say this very clearly to people, that, you know, this isn't fixed. There will be additional sessions that we can run, but we'll pick up those ideas as we go. So please do, as I say, use the chat box, but bear in mind that we'll pick them up over the course, and it may be in September or October that we'll schedule additional sessions. The other thing I wanted to say, knowing that we're going to the holiday season, what's left of it, is that we will flex things. If we find that people are unable to come to certain sessions, we may shift them back by a week or two. And in a couple of cases where I'm working with additional people, sometimes from outside the organisation, to help run sessions, we may need to change them if their holiday plans change. So we'll be keeping people up to speed through the calendar on how that works. Okay, so let me crack on and start talking about what's going to be covered in this webinar. So I'm going to introduce you to creative industries, make sure everybody's clear about what the term is, what it means, what's defined by it and what isn't. So that includes looking at the size and scale of the sector, but I'll do that very briefly because those are things that we'll cover in other sessions. What I'm going to spend most time on today is looking back at the origins. Where has the term creative industries come from? What's the context in terms of policy? What's the context in terms of the economy? And actually then to focus, the main focus of today's webinar is looking at the policy history from the 1990s through to 2020, where we are now. But I'm going to finish with some words about terminology, because I know it will have been confusing and I will have covered some of the terms here, but I do want to spend a bit of time explaining the different words that can be used in and around the creative industries and the creative economy, so that you can understand how things fit together. So let me start right at the top. Creative industries. The definition creative industries, as understood by the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and indeed by the Treasury, is this one. This is a definition that has been in place since 1998 and still stands. Now, I won't go into the detail of what the implications of that are, but that has been through the ringer a few times, and that it has been interrogated, slightly reframed, and although it is very, very slightly different from the definition that was first used in 1998, this is the one that still stands, and the intellectual property element is key. You'll notice the word creativity in there. There's no reference to arts, there's no reference to industry specifically, there's no reference to culture. And I'll pick some of those ideas up, and that's all quite relevant. But this is a term that is used to refer to these sectors. These are the acknowledged 9 subsectors that make up the creative industries. And I will pick up some of the terminology around this, some of the anomalies that people might have spotted as to what's in there and what's not in there, about how certain things are framed, why computer services, for example, rather than computer games. I mentioned GLAM as a sector: galleries, libraries, archives and museums. Why not archives here? So, but this is the accepted set of subsectors which are used to, in policy, for policy purposes, and are used to define a sector which has the following. So these are the subsectors. Sorry, these are the standard industrial classifications. This is pretty dull, I'm afraid, but I just wanted to identify this. This may be something that people want to explore more fully. It may be something that's a bit dull and boring, but I just wanted to, again, to illustrate that these aren't terms that are plucked out of the air. There is a considerable amount of research behind it, and these are ONS definitions that now form part of a very accepted set of subsectors that constitute the creative industries. So how big, we hear a lot about how big the creative industries are and how important they are to the economy. And there is a view abroad in some areas that this is a lot of rhetoric associated with that. My view is that the reason why it's seen as being rhetorical rather than hard in terms of the data is not because of the lack of research, but because actually it's quite new research, as we'll show in a moment. But these are the current figures. These are published figures by government within the last few months. So these are figures that are very, very recent. They're actually, so they were published this year. The figures relate to 2018, 2.1 million employed in the sector. An incredibly fast growing sector. So again, this is not rhetoric, this is, and just to give people a feel really of what this means, is if you look at other sectors. So, people might be really surprised to hear that the life sciences, about which we hear so much, actually employs a tenth in terms of employment of the creative industries sector, and contributes far less in terms of GVA, gross value added. Gross value added is the contribution that a sector makes back to the economy. So it's not the turnover of a sector, it's the additional benefit, if you like, that accrues to the economy as a result of this sector. So a really significant sector. And there are a number of key features which I'm just going to highlight very, very quickly now, but we're going to pick up on in future lectures. It's worthwhile people knowing, incredibly London-centric. More than 50% of the GVA that's generated from the creative industries is generated from creative industries in London. There are twice as many freelancers working in the creative industries as there are in the rest of the economy. There are twice as many degree-educated people, or people with degrees, who work in the creative industries than in the rest of the economy. And may be surprised to hear that there are more Black, Asian and minority ethnic employees in the creative industries. However, as we will find in the session on diversity, there is huge variation across the different subsectors, and the picture isn't quite as positive as it might appear to be. So those are the key features of the sector. I don't want to spend any more time on that. We'll pick these up in the future webinars. But I just wanted to give that very, very quick introduction to the sector so that people have got a bit of an awareness about the sector that we're talking about, the size and the impact that it has, and the general demography, if you like, and the economic and demographic makeup. So let me get now into the meat of what today's session is going to focus on. First of all, the political origins, creative industries. Where does the term come from? It's not an exaggeration to say that creative industries is a term that was invented by the new Labour government in 1997. It was a term that hadn't been used before then, and it was a term that not only started to get a lot of profile during that period, but actually politically it was pushed very hard, and it was part of a transformation that was taking place politically under Tony Blair and with Chris Smith and others, that's reflected in a number of different ways. And some of the things here are really quite significant. The renaming of a department. We've had lots of departments, in particular, what is now BASE, has been through a number of different name changes over the last few years. That hadn't happened for decades before. And what had been a Department for National Heritage was changed to Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And that was seen as really quite a significant change. A creative industries task force was established, chaired by Chris Smith, which had 10 government ministers on it. Ministers from 10 government departments sat around the table. So this was about saying that creative industries is something that affects the economy. It affects work and pensions. It affects social security. It affects, or it has an impact is relevant for the Home Office because of immigration and skills and development. Clearly relevant to the Department for Education and a whole set of departments. But there was a really strong message here, which was about, this is a new administration, new Labour, that was clear in the name. It's a new way of thinking about a sector and a set of sectors that form part of the economy. And the government that came in gave a lot of credit to an initiative that had been run in Australia a few years before, a document that had been published called Creative Nation, but a new, again, a similar program that had been developed in Australia a few years before, which was about trying to reframe arts and creativity as central to our lives and much more higher profile, that rather than something off to the side, and again, look at the words, rather than something being about the heritage and about the past, it was much more about the current and something much more vibrant. And that identity link was very important as well, because it was about saying, and again, that link to New Labour, it's about saying we're entering into a new phase. It's about our sense of being British and what being British is. Now, this you might think is an inappropriate image. This is actually lifted directly from, with one small change. This is lifted from the front cover of Vanity Fair in 1998, which was seen as the beginning of Cool Britannia. It was this Vanity Fair, an international publication that got a huge amount of coverage. Tony Blair's face has been photoshopped onto, I think, what was one of the Gallagher brothers. But there was a sense that creative industries were part of a whole new change and a transformation taking place in the UK economy and society, which was absolutely central to what New Labour was about. And it was a sense of a new dawn, a new set of beginnings. So it's really important that it was framed in, that you understand it was framed in those terms in 1998. But I want to give a bit of background to that. It didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't just a PR process. It actually, there were some real reasons for the development and growth of the creative industries at this time and why it was considered to be such an important part of the economy. Now, this might sound like a bizarre place to start to talk about what has been one of the fastest growing sectors, but actually massive unemployment in the 1970s was a significant part, because what there was a large number of people who weren't going into normal routes of employment, and who, in the context of new government coming in 1979 with Margaret Thatcher, a change in thinking about the welfare state, and real strong encouragement to shift the way of addressing unemployment was to get people to set up their own business, or at least it was about thinking entrepreneurially. So economic and indeed in policy terms, there was a shift towards small business development and a focus on enterprise and enterprise development. And there was something called the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which some of us might be old enough to remember, but others may have heard about. This was a really quite significant and important development. It was a way of moving people off the unemployment figures. And if young people or people had an idea for setting up a business, they were allowed an additional pot of money they could access to set up an enterprise. It was an enterprise allowance scheme, and a huge number of people that subsequently went on to set up their own creative business during the 1980s and 1990s benefited from the enterprise allowance scheme. There are also big funding programs being delivered out of regional programs. So the Greater London Council, in its heyday in the early 1980s, the GLC and the other metropolitan county councils that were in the big urban centres around the UK, so in Greater Manchester, in Merseyside, in the West Midlands, in Yorkshire and the North East, those metropolitan county councils were all abolished in 1986. But in the early 1980s, they all started to respond to this youth unemployment, the trend that had started, that had developed in the economy at the end of the 1970s, by putting money, making money available for small business development. And the European Regional Development Fund, which was an EU fund, significant EU fund, which went to Objective 1 and Objective 2 areas in the UK, so areas that were suffering from high unemployment and deprivation, also benefited hugely. So the first ever cultural industries program was run by Merseyside, in Merseyside. It was an ERDF program in the 1990s. And that again was about trying to move people out of unemployment into small businesses, and a vast number benefited and became what were called the New Independents. There was a book written by Kate Oakley and Charlie Ledbetter in the early 1990s, which aimed to describe this phenomenon, which was this new phenomenon of a very, very large number of small businesses being set up by people who had been unemployed, or were in some cases were in a sort of grey area of employment, and they may have many jobs. They may be teachers, they may be artists doing a whole range of different things, but actually they were setting up their own businesses and becoming independents. And it's what subsequently became known as the knowledge economy. And of course, this phenomenon is not peculiar to the creative industries. We're talking about a set of sectors, including life sciences and others, where people were developing businesses and where people were starting to trade off the back of ideas and services rather than on the back of products and widgets. And so this was the economy into which the creative industry started to come. Now, for many people, so Larry Elliott, who was the economics correspondent for The Guardian at the time, wrote a book with a colleague, another journalist called Dan Atkinson, which was Fantasy Island. Their view was that actually what Tony Blair had done was started to build something on sand, that actually by letting the manufacturing sector collapse and to build things off the back of sectors like the creative industries, we were actually creating a fantasy island, which actually was going to amount to very, very little. And there's a chapter of the Fantasy Island book, which was very influential, called Bullshit Britain, which is actually a chapter quite specifically on the creative industries. So this was a view abroad that despite the growth of this knowledge economy, that somehow the knowledge economy was built on sand, and actually it was bullshit, it was meaningless, it was nothing. But the critical thing here, as we now know, as it were, 15 or so years later, is that this was a global phenomenon. It wasn't just a PR stunt, it was something that was happening across the world. Let's talk about the policy context, which is what is supposed to be the focus of today. I'm going to start actually further back. Where does the concept of creative industries begin? Well, actually, the first time anything of any of this kind was written was in 1947. So the Frankfurt School, that some of you may know about, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, I think, wrote an essay called The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception in 1947. This was a time when Walter Benjamin and others were talking about art in the age of mass reproduction. So this was a period, there was an understanding then, but it didn't really build as an academic or policy subject. What developed in the 60s and 70s was a school of thought around the role of culture in society, and it was much more about the role of art and culture as a social phenomenon rather than an economic phenomenon. And it wasn't actually until the late 1980s that there were any serious pieces of works and study done around the economic role of the creative and cultural sector. This book in 1987 by John Myerscough, although it was about the arts in Britain, was actually a very important and critical document, because for the first time, somebody was trying to look at the economic impact that sectors that hitherto have been thought of as being soft subjects, soft areas of the economy, were starting to look at. And then this built, I'm going to speed up a bit, this built in the 1980s, there were a series of publications from a publishing house called Comedia, a lot of people who were involved in the Greater London Council. In academics terms, the Manchester Institute of Popular Culture to Manchester Metropolitan University, or what is now Manchester Metropolitan University, was the first academic or research centre that started to look at the cultural industries, and the term wasn't in use at the time, creative industries, as an important part of the economy worthy of study. So let me run through the policy evolution from 1998 to 2010. And I'll race through some of this because I'm conscious of time, and it may be that it's here that people will want to start to identify things that they'd like to hear more about as we progress. So first of all, pre-1998. The debate was about the relationship between culture and industry, what C.P. Snow in the 50s and 60s, I think, had referred to as the two cultures, the interrelationship between art and industry. And before 1998, this was the nature of policy discussion, to try to understand is it about Saturday night or Sunday morning? This is the title of a book written by Jeff Morgan, formerly of Nesta, and Demos before that, and Ken Walpole. This was written in about 1985. And it was really trying to say, well, actually, should cultural policy be about Sunday morning, which was about going to church and about brass bands and very traditional concepts of culture, or should it be actually about music, night clubbing, and actually everything that's associated with going out on a Saturday night and making money? And that's what was picked up in 1998 with the creative industries and the introduction of the term creative industries. And the focus in that first 5 years of the new Labour term was on the economic impact of the creative industries. The first creative industries mapping document looked at the various subsectors, and in this particular case, they're very garish images were used to talk about sectors like advertising. And then this is the second mapping study, which was published in 2001. Similarly, high profile use of design here to highlight the economic importance. That was the real focus of the policy debate that took place up to 2001. Then between 2001 and 2010, which in many senses I would say is the heyday of creative industries, it was a period during which things were started to be embedded into policy in all sorts of different ways. There was a push to try and get creative industries really embedded into the educational and social fabric and across government departments. That failed, frankly, in terms of education, and there was a big project that was developed around education which failed to make much headway in terms of the curriculum. And there was a document published in 2008. Andy Burnham was the, now Mayor of Manchester, was the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport at the time. He launched what was considered to be a pretty disappointing document. And it was felt that, and it was actually at a local and regional level that more impact was being made. So something fantastic that was initiated in about 2005 in London, Creative London, a big initiative headed by the Mayor of London with some great people working for it at the time, was an example of the sorts of developments. Creative Sheffield was created in 2007. So a push to really embed creative industries in local authority level, but it was the regional development agencies in particular that played the biggest role during this period and were major investment partners in distributing funding and actually building creative industries across the UK and at the forefront of creative industries development. Nesta must play a really important part in this role, and in particular, I will name check him, Hassan Bakshi, who was by far has done a huge amount for creative industries research. He introduced a set of terms, and the research that he led introduced a set of terms during the the second half of the noughties, so sort of 2006, 7 and 8, series of documents that looked at the concept of creative intensity, creative innovation and the creative economy. So it's really not just looking at the creative industries, but what's the impact that the creative industries are beginning to have across the wider economy. And it was during this period that actually the creative industries really exploded and took off internationally. So led by the UK, with the British Council playing a really big role promoting creative industries around the world. And in 2008, the United Nations, so UNESCO, publishing a first document looking at the creative economy. And that's a sign of the extent to which creative industries were now forming themselves really embedded themselves through the economy from local, regional, national, right up into international, and by 2010 really established as a major sector in society. Now, I'm going to pause, but only momentarily. I would say the period from 2010 to 2017, although the creative industries have been established, it's actually pretty quiet in terms of policy initiative and policy developments. And that's because there was a government coming in. It's not a political point, it's a straightforward point. Sajid David, subsequently, he wasn't the first business secretary, but he was a business secretary during for the Conservatives during this period, and he said there is no such thing as industrial strategy. In London, there was a change of mayor. The incoming mayor, very, very strong on culture and on the arts, but really didn't like the term creative industries, and the term was dropped in London. The regional development agencies were abolished, and all of the initiatives that have been developed over previous years, in particular through local authorities and regional development agencies, actually stopped or were wound down quite considerably. But a series of important things did take place. A Creative Industries Council was established in July 2011. This was really important in terms of recognition of the sector. It was about saying the sector now was being recognized in particular by BEIS. So it was co-chaired by somebody from industry. To start with, it was Nicola Mendelsohn, who's from Facebook, with the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport and the Secretary of State, the Business Secretary. So that's really important and quite significant acknowledgement of how central creative industries is to government policy making now. As I said, although bizarrely there were no major initiatives during this period, nonetheless there was this sense of consolidation. You have arrived, you don't need lots of initiatives now. We are going to establish some fairly formal structures that recognise that. Creative England was established, which was an amalgamation actually of a number of screen agencies that had existed, but this was something that Ed Vasey led with Caroline Norbury, who was had been chief executive of the Southwest Regional Screen Agency, and created a new body called Creative England, chaired by John Newbegin, interestingly, who was special advisor to Chris Smith back in 1998 and who'd been instrumental in creating the term creative industries in the first instance. But I would suggest the most important players actually during this 7-year period were the Technology Strategy Board, as it then was, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council. If you look back at where creative industries initiatives were being progressed, where creative industries funding was coming from, up until 2010, it was very much driven by the regional development agencies. From 2010 onwards, these three bodies, I would suggest, had the biggest role in terms of funding. The EPSRC most significantly, actually, through their digital economy program. The AHRC through its creative economy knowledge exchange hubs that it ran towards the end of this period. And the TSB, not very much money, only 2 or 3% of its funding over the last 15 years has gone into creative industries, but nonetheless, it's relatively speaking, it's quite significant. And it pains me to say that actually, in the sense that we're not going to receive this funding anymore, European funding has been really significant as well. A lot of money that's gone through local authorities and regional bodies into the creative industries through the European Regional Development Fund and the European Social Fund. So, I can't see the bottom of my screen to see if there's anything. Yeah, global marketing. Ah, yes, this was my final point, was that actually, if you were to characterize this period at all from a governmental point of view, what did government do during this period is they promoted the UK as a centre for creative industries. You might be familiar with this campaign, but this, I look back and really look for initiatives and sort of what was the policy flavour was coming from central government. The big push was, let's promote the strength of the creative industries in the UK and promote that overseas. Right, coming up to the current day, we've seen a huge amount over the last 2 to 3 years. I mean, really very, very significant indeed, driven by the industrial strategy. So I'll run through the dates. The Industrial Strategy Green Paper was published in January 2017. At the time, it was felt as if it was a document that really didn't understand the creative industries at all. There was barely any reference to them, except for one thing, which said we are going to commission Sir Peter Bazalgette to go away and look at the creative industries in more depth, because we think there might be something they should, that we might need to look at. Peter Bazalgette published his report on the creative industries in September 2017, and that led to, in effect, a whole series of things that people will be familiar with now. Interestingly enough, the Creative Clusters Programme preceded the publication of the Industrial Strategy. So the Creative Industries Clusters Programme, which is now an Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund Programme, was led and kicked off by the AHRC before the Industrial Strategy was published in November 2017. And it was the Industrial Strategy in November 2017 that referenced the Audience the Future programme, which is then featured in more detail in the Creative Industries Sector Deal in March 2018. So what the characteristics, if the characteristics of the period 2010 to 2017 was about promoting the UK overseas, the main characteristic of the last few years, I would suggest, is about a new and actually a very novel focus on research and development, because that had not been a feature of any of the policy before 2017. I think that's really important to bear in mind within an organisation which is now obviously devoting a lot of all of its resources to R&D, that actually this wasn't something that was associated with the creative industries before 2017. So coming towards the end, not quite there, I just want to policy or terminology I've got here, because in a sense what I've done is I've covered the ground. I've said that, well, before 1998, and in fact before the 1990s at all, we were talking about culture, and that was the main focus of people's attention, and the role of culture in society. It was in the 1980s and 1990s that people started to use the term cultural industries, and there were policy documents and academic studies kicked off around the cultural industries. The word creative industries was invented in 1998 and was absolutely central to policy making in government through to 2010, and indeed through to 2017. Although, as I've said, it felt like it was a real heyday from 1998 to 2010. But you would have heard, I'll come back to creative economy. That was a term that started to gain some credibility and profile over the last 5 years or so. And as I've just said, creative R&D is something that really is a very, very recent phenomenon. So let me go back. I've got various slides and I'm being chased by Namdi. I will speed up, and these may be things that people want to pick up on. But I want to end by saying, actually, it really is quite complex. Although creative industries is established as a sector that can be clearly defined with some data behind it, with ONS and Treasury understanding and commitment, it is actually a very new topic, and it's a very live topic. So first of all, it was only invented in 1998. Compare that to other sectors like the automotive sector or life sciences, where we've had data and we've been gathering data and developing policy for decades. The 9 subsectors that we have didn't actually come in until 2014. So in 1998, the antiques market was considered to be part of the creative industries. In 1998, museums, galleries, and libraries were not considered to be part of the creative industries, but they are now. So it's an evolving topic. And if you look at the DCMS website, I'm not going to spend time on this. I think the main message to get from this is that it's incredibly complex. These are the sectors that the Department for Culture, Media and Sport looks after. They are very clear about the interrelationship and the overlaps between the creative industries, which includes, as you see, advertising, marketing, architecture, and so on. And they will say it's very distinct from culture, which includes historic sites and the manufacture of musical instruments. But I think the main takeaway from this is that it's actually really quite complex. And there is a live debate still as to how important it is. And in fact, for a dynamic sector, how relevant it is still to cling tight to the notion of creative industries. So creative industries or creative economy, or indeed anything else. I'm going to end by talking about creative industries, creative economy, because I think there is one important clarification that I want to communicate here, because you will see that both terms are used. So notwithstanding the previous slide that I've shown, which shows that it's messy, creative industries is a term that is understood and is measured on a regular basis. The creative industries are a subset, however, of the creative economy. The creative economy includes everyone working in a creative role. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. The designer who works for Rolls-Royce works within the creative economy, but is not within the creative industries. The drama teacher is not in the creative industries, but is part of the creative economy and will be counted as part of the creative industry, but is not part of the creative industries and is not part of the terminology that I've been using throughout. The drama teacher, by the way, who might have a part-time job running a small drama company, or the art teacher who might be also an artist and run their own business, of course, that business will be part of the creative industries, albeit that as a teacher, they are part of the creative economy. Confusing? Maybe. The important point I wanted to make here was that This slippery subject has some really important implications. It's not just about measuring, it is a political point. My political point that I wanted to end up with, I want you to look at the left-hand side here. This is a UNESCO term for what they consider to be the cultural sector. They don't use the term creative industries because they feel it's too narrow, that it doesn't take account of museums. It doesn't take account of cultural landscapes and natural heritage. In many senses, it doesn't take account of what makes people, what is people's culture and what's really distinctive about a part of who a person is, what a community is, or what a nation is. And I think that's where I wanted to leave it today in terms of policy terms. So although I've raced through it and I've tried to, I hope to make clear that creative industries is absolutely central to the policy landscape in the UK. It's, and which reflects the fact, and its evolution reflects the fact that it's a new sector and a dynamic sector. So it's a new sector, remember, I think that's really important. But it has been politically driven and economically driven. There are a number of reasons why we are where we are today. It is a global phenomenon. So it's not just the creative industries that's been grappling with these topics. Here are things that we'll pick up on in future lectures, and I'm conscious of time. So it's a sector made up of freelancers, highly uneven geographically, highly educated but relatively unequal. But it has been absolutely central to government policy making, but it is a contested area of government policy making. And it's a contested policy space. And I want people to know that, because although this is a lecture, I want people to feel that this is a space for debate. So notwithstanding the fact that there are very clear definitions, actually, this is a space for discussion and debate, and this is a live space, and it is a space, the part of the reason for setting up this program of seminars or webinars in the first place is to bring people, give people the knowledge and information so that actually you can participate in the policy debates as we start to shape our thinking as UKRI over the next few weeks and months. I'm going to finish by just saying, here are future sessions. The reason why I want to highlight these is that I'm going to spend just a few minutes now to ask you to use the chat box. Bearing in mind that these things, the industrial character, the technology, a closer look at technology, a closer look at equality, are things that we're going to look at in the next few sessions. In preparing for this lecture, I realized I hadn't allowed time for a discussion on geography. I'm proposing in our third session, the next discussion session, that we focus on geography. But I please do now use the chat box to put in any other ideas that you have as to what you would like to see discussed in that third session that hasn't been covered today or that has been skated over today. I'm going to stop there.